So I just have to tell you a little bit about this Rebbe. He was an extraordinary man. He was interned. He survived the Holocaust in Auschwitz, and when he came out, he of course was closer to death than alive. And amazingly, his wife survived as well, and the two of them immigrated to the United States, and he resurrected the Kalava Chassidut here. It's not a large movement like the Lubavitcher or the Bratslava even, but it's vibrant and alive. There is a group of Kalava Hasidim in Brooklyn, Williamsburg, and there is another group in Jerusalem. And as I mentioned, he died a year ago, and he had two sons. He was 96 when he died, and one of his sons leads the group in Brooklyn, and the other one leads the Kalava Hasidic group in Jerusalem. Now, the fact that the first Kalava Rebbe insisted that all of his Hasidim speak Hungarian and speak it well had a profound effect on the fate of Jewry in Hungary and the surrounding areas, because in 1848, until 1848, that area was the Austrian Empire. And then in 1848, the Hungarians rebelled, and there was a revolution, and there was fighting, and the Hungarians were granted autonomy and control over about half of the empire. And the Austrian Empire became the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The emperor was still Austrian, Franz Joseph at that time. But now Hungary controlled a huge area that stretched from the Balkans through Romania, part of Romania, all the way to Poland and the Ukraine. And so this was about 50 million people. Now, most of the people had been repressed. They had very little schooling, and they were pretty much the hoi polloi, so to speak, were illiterate. And the Hungarian gentry now was also semi-literate only. And now they had a lot of opportunities. They had estates, they were able to start factories, but they needed somebody to run them. And the Jews were ready to do that because they spoke perfect and wrote perfect Hungarian. So um, the opportunities were opened up for Jews. They could now leave. Before that, they couldn't. They could leave the shtetls and move into the cities and move around this empire, and they became pivotal to running the Hungarian part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Many of them became very wealthy. The second generation, as is not this is the usual case, went to the universities, and they became famous scientists. There were about 49% of the physicians in the Austro-Hungarian Empire were Jews, 43% of the lawyers, and most of the businesses were run by Jews. Now, that had, of course, some problems. It generated a lot of anti-Semitism. So Jews were restricted, but they could not tolerate the restrictions. So, for example, they wanted to be totally assimilated. Those that, not the Hasidim, but those that left the shtetls. But for example, the favorite, the dominant sport among Hungarian gentry was fencing. They wouldn't let the Jews into the fencing clubs. So the Jews started their own fencing clubs, and they became so good at it, they were so focused on the whole process that they defeated the all Hungarian fencing clubs. And when the Olympics came, the Jewish fencing club represented Hungary, and they won all the gold medals in the fencing for Hungary. The same thing happened in swimming and chess and various other um, um, enterprises, but of course it fed virulent anti-Semitism. So although Hungary was the Jews of Hungary, I leave out this relatively small Hasidic segment, while the Jews of Hungary were most assimilated of Jews in Europe, except with the exception possibly of Austrian Jewry, they were the most discriminated against Jews there. But that takes us into a different domain. And I'd like to continue by telling you a story which involves the Kalever Rebbe, the first Kalever Rebbe. Now, as you probably now surmised, Hasidic stories, as many folk stories, enter or take us into a different domain, and take us into the domain of magic and altered states and secrets and mysteries. And then in the Hasidic stories, they bring us back to real life, and hopefully it's the intent of most of these Hasidic stories to leave us with some teaching, in a sort of a state that brings us closer to holiness, to God. So this is one of those stories. But the interesting stories, as I talked about last time, the interesting stories about interesting thing about Hasidic stories is that they do not reveal in a straightforward way the message. And in my reading of many, many Hasidic stories, you maybe only in one or two, you get some scholars who try to explain what this story is about. But most of the time, there is no explanation. It remains up to us to find the hidden message in it. And this is one of these stories that I will tell you is such a one with a mysterious hidden message. So the story begins in Lublin, in Poland, with Yaakov Yitzchak Horowitz of Lublin, a great Rebbe himself. He was called the seer of Lublin because, according to legend, he had the ability to see visions, to see what was happening far, far away, many hundreds of miles away, and give an accurate report of what was going on there. So the seer of Lublin, the holy Lubliner Rebbe, decided to send two of his young Hasidic students, by young I mean probably in the around 20, to spend Pesach, Passover, with the Kalev Rebbe. So they set out to go to Kalev. Now, the distance between Lublin and Kalev is quite a trip. It took them a month to get to Kalev, and they arrived just in time for the first Seder. They walked into the Kalev Rebbe's home, and they were welcomed very warmly by the Rebbe and the Rebbitzin. But then they noticed something very strange. The Kalev Rebbe was not wearing the usual Hasidic shtramel and the fur hat, the kaftan. He was dressed as a peasant for a holiday, which was a special dress the peasants had. These were sort of white denim pants. I'm telling you this, the story does not, but I know how they dressed. Boots and an embroidered shirt and a cap. So that's how the Kalev Rebbe was dressed. And his wife, the Rebbitzin, wore high-heeled shoes, a gown. She wore jewelry, and she had makeup on, unheard of. So they were very surprised. But the Seder table was set according to regulation. There were the three matzot there. There was the Seder plate with the hard-boiled egg, with the roasted shank, with the maror, the bitter herbs, and charoset, the chopped apples with nuts and honey. And there was wine. So they were just a little bit pacified. And the Rebbe began to recite the usual invocation at the beginning of after the blessings, which says, "This is the bread of affliction." He raised the matzot, and which we ate in the land of Egypt, and he went through that whole invocation, ending with, "This year we are slaves, next year may we be free, this year we are here, next year may we be in Jerusalem," when there was a commotion outside. Those Hasidim looked out the window and they saw an unbelievably beautiful coach drive up with 4 horses pulling it, gold lining on the walls of the coach. The coach stopped, and out of the coach stepped out 3 Hungarian officers dressed in fancy dress with epaulets and medals, fancy officers, a Hungarian officer's cap. And then the greatest surprise, out came a beautiful young woman. She wore a tiara on her dark long hair with jewels of rubies and pearls and diamonds. She wore a beautiful damask gown. And high-heeled shoes. And the officers escorted her into the Rebbe of Kalev's, the Kalever Rebbe's house. And the Kalever Rebbe hugged, and they greeted each other warmly. He hugged the officers. The beautiful woman hugged the Rebbetzin. And then they sat down and they started to talk in Hungarian, and they were having fun and laughing. And when the brachot came, they kind of mumbled, the Rebbe mumbled the brachot, and they did drink the 4 cups of wine. But other than that, they just were having a wonderful time, laughing in Hungarian, telling what looked like to them jokes. They did never open the Haggadah. The 2 Hasidim from Lublin were shocked. They sort of withdrew towards the end of the table. They opened up the Haggadah and they started reading it. Just the 2 of them. They went through the 4 questions. Why is this night different? And they read the whole thing all the way down to Chadgadya, which they sort of quietly sang, just so they could hear it, which tells the story, the father buys a lamb and the cat kills the lamb and the dog kills the cat, and all the way down until God kills death. And when they finished, the Seder was finished. The 3 Hungarian officers got up, and the beautiful young woman turned and came to the 2 Hasidim. Now, all through the night, they averted their eyes from looking at this gorgeous woman, because a true Hasid is not supposed to stare at a young woman. And she looked at them and said, "Did you have a good time? Did you understand?" And the 2 Hasidim shook their head, no. And then the 3 officers and the beautiful young woman left. They got into the coach and drove away. Now, the 2 Hasidim had to still spend the rest of the 8 days with the Rebbe of Kalev. That went normally. He put on his Hasidic garb, but still they were very ill at ease, very confused. And then it occurred to them, now what was this? This young woman came and spoke to them, but they understood what she asked. So clearly she could not have spoken Hungarian, because they didn't understand Hungarian at all. So this was a bit of a puzzle, but they left it alone. And again, they went on the long trip back to Lublin, and they were wondering all the way, what did they do wrong that the Rebbe had punished them this way, sending them to such a weird, unreasonable Seder? So when they came back to Lublin, they told the Rebbe what happened. They told them about the 3 officers and the beautiful young woman. And the Rebbe asked them, "Did you understand what this was?" And the 2 Hasidim said, no. And the Rebbe said, "Oi, Gewalt, you didn't." The 3 officers were our 3 fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And the beautiful young woman was the Shekhinah. And had you only realized that, you could have speeded up redemption. You could have speeded up the coming of the Mashiach. But now you didn't. It turns out that one of the Hasidim said later that while the Seder was going on, the Seer of Lublin, the Jose of Lublin, said, I'm trying to hear what the Rebbe, Kalever Rebbe, is how he's praying, but he must be again praying in Hungarian because I can't make it out. And that's the end of the story. So the puzzle is, the mystery is, what's going on here? What was happening? So I'm going to tell you my thinking on it. Then I'll tell another story and I'll leave the interpretation to you because I haven't been able to figure it out. But I think what went on here, what goes on here, is that the Seder, the Pesach, was not chosen arbitrarily. The first thing that we do, or one of the first things we do on Seder, we ask, how is this night different? And here were two devout Chasidim, and they actually asked, how is this night different from all the other nights? And my God, it was staring them in the face, but they never asked. They just went through the motions. They did not face the most potent and possible teaching here to find out what is happening in their world around them, trying to understand what the nature of this reality for them is and what it says to them. And as a result, it became clear, had they only realized, they could have spoken and they could have pleaded for their people, for the Jews, to bring the Mashiach faster, to bring redemption closer. But they didn't connect with this mystery. They missed it completely. And so the trip was lost on them and consequently on whom they represented, the people of Israel. That's how I see this story. But it probably has many more layers that I missed. So I'd like to tell you another story of the Rebbe, of the Kalever Rebbe, and see if what we can make out of that, because as I said, I haven't, but then I haven't spent all that much time thinking about it. So this will be a homework. And if any of you figure out what it means, you can send me an email or you can just talk about it. We'll start with an attempt to understand it. So this is what happened. It turns out that the Kalever Rebbe had another strange custom. In addition to going into the field and learning Hungarian folk songs, he had another custom that before every one of the pilgrimage holidays, and there are 3 of them from the Torah, these are Torah holidays, that is, it's Pesach, Shavuot, and Sukkot. And on those holidays, the 3 holidays, the Rebbe in the afternoon would disappear and would be away for 3-4 hours in the afternoon. And then he would come back, he would return. But nobody knew where he went. And when asked, he would just say, "Sha, I'm not telling you." So there was a man who, and that's a real man. His descendants still are alive and are actually Kalever Hasidim. His name was Yaakov Fish, and he was also the Gabbai of the Kalever Rebbe. So one Sukkot afternoon, when usually the Rebbe would disappear, he hid himself before the Rebbe came to his wagon. He hid himself under the straw in the Rebbe's wagon. And the Rebbe came, and there were horses. He reined the horses to the wagon, and the coach started to go. And now, of course, the Rebbe, Yaakov Fish was under the straw. He didn't see what was happening, but he felt they were traveling incredibly fast. And then the coach stopped. The wagon stopped. And he poked his head out, and the Rebbe saw him. He said, "Oh, you caused me a lot of trouble by hiding here, a lot of trouble." So Fish looked around, Yaakov Fish looked around, and he was in a strange place. He's never seen a place like that. The scents were different, the weather felt different, there was a warm wind. He didn't know where he was. So he got out of the coach. The Rebbe walked down the path, ignoring Yaakov. And Yaakov Fish walked around. He saw some people. They were speaking a language he didn't understand, but some of them spoke Hebrew. And so he asked, "Where am I?" And they said, "Well, what kind of a question is this? Where are you? Don't you know?" And he said, "No, I really don't know where I am." So they figured he must be kind of lost his mind. He said, "You're in Swat." Swat? He knew, of course, about Swat. Everybody who studies Kabbalah knows about Swat. He said, "I'm in Swat? Really?" He says, "Yes, of course." So tell me, where does this path lead down which my Rebbe walked down? He said, "That path leads to the mikveh of the Ari, the person who wrote the Luria, Rebbe Luria, who wrote the Lurianic Kabbalah, which is one of the central teachings of the Chasidim in Europe. And that's his mikveh is over there. So it was clear what he was doing. Before these holidays, the Rebbe came to dip into the Aris, the Rebbe Luria's mikveh. So he said, "Well, that's what he's doing. How did he get so fast here? How did we do this?" And then he realized there is a magic power which some Rebbes have. And obviously, the Kalever Rebbe kept it secret, but he had this power of kvitzat haderech, which means skipping over the road, which allows a person to travel incredibly fast, long distances in almost no time. So it must be the Rebbe has that power. But he was now fascinated with Sfat. He went to the shul of the Arizal, the Rebbe Luria. He walked around. He talked to people, those who spoke Hebrew. He figured out that the rest to whom he couldn't talk were speaking Ladino, that Spanish Jewish dialect of Spanish. And he even met some Hasidim who actually by that time had gotten to Sfat, who spoke Yiddish. And he talked to them and said, "Oh my God, I have to get back." So he ran to where he left the wagon, but the wagon was already gone. So he knew that he would now have to wait till Pesach when the Rebbe would return to get back to Kalev. So he did the best he could. It wasn't so bad. He joined the European Hasidim in their group for study and for prayer, and he went to the shul of Rabbi Luria, and time passed. Meanwhile, back in Kalev, his relatives, his wife and his children were just out of their mind. Where is our father? Where is my husband? So, of course, they went to the Rebbe and they said, "Where is he? What's going on?" And the Rebbe said, "Don't worry. He went on a long trip, but he will be, I guarantee, he will be back by the next Seder, which is only a few months, so just wait. And Seder, the next Pesach came, and already Yaakov Fish was waiting for the wagon, and he got on even before the Rebbe went to the mikveh and came back. And the Rebbe said, listen, you pulled the trick on me, but you have to swear to me that you'll never tell anybody what happened here while I am alive. And sure enough, Yaakov Fish kept the secret. And then the Kalever Rebbe left this world. And that's when he really revealed what happened and where the Rebbe had been going for every festival. And this is where the story ends. So, any ideas what this story means? What is it teaching us? It took us into a world of surprising wonders and magic and mystery, and then brought us back to this world, which is our everyday world. And what did we learn from it?
I have a question, and that is who actually tells that story? Because it's not the rabbi himself.
It's not the rabbi. Most Hasidic stories are not told by the rabbi. They're told by anonymous storytellers like me. Some stories we know where they originated, who was the first person who told it. Most people know, most people can tell you where they first heard the story, but most people do not know how it came to be. And I can tell you these stories change over time. They are not told the same way every time, but the essence is unchanged. So this is told originally probably by one of the Kalever Hasidim sitting around the fire, smoking pipes. By the way, smoking was one thing the European Hasidim did. They smoked a lot. They smoked mostly pipes, and then they smoked cigarettes. They loved tobacco. They didn't drink so much coffee at all, but they drank tea. So that was their favorite thing, to sit around. And after study, somebody would tell me a story about the Rebbe. And that's how this story came to be. I will tell you where I first read the first story, because that is actually is a story in itself. The story I told you about the first story about the soldiers, the officers, and the young woman, I first read in this book, 9 Gates to Hasidic Mystery. This book was written by a man named Jiří Langer. He was a Jewish young man in Prague from a very assimilated, but Jewish family. And he went to university. He was brilliant. I don't know, somehow everybody there was brilliant, but that is what is said about him. This preface here is written by his brother. He spoke something like 7 languages fluently. He was a genius in languages. Spoke Italian, German, of course, Czech, Russian, spoke English, among others. He was very dissatisfied with the Jewishness around him. The Prague Jews were assimilated beyond good taste. So, for example, in the synagogues, the Neolog synagogue where most Jews in Prague began, that's like the Reform synagogue that most Jews belong to. the liturgy was sang by professional opera singers. They hired opera singers to sing the Jewish, they were not Jews, but of course, opera singers can sing in any language. And they sang, it was a performance. And the people who, the congregation were simply an audience with no, and they came usually in high hats, dressed in formal clothing. To him, this was sort of just totally unsatisfactory. He wanted to experience Judaism, about which he read. So at that time, this was the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Just before World War I, 1911, you could travel from one end of the empire to the other, about 600 miles, and you move from ultra-modern cities, hyper-modern like Prague, with the highest culture of theater, opera, libraries, museums. You could travel to places in the east, which are now part of Ukraine, like Belz and many others, Uzhgorod, that were like unchanged for the past 200 years. So he took a train, which was a 24-hour ride from Prague to Belz. You didn't need any passports, just buy a ticket. This was the same country. And he came to Belz, where probably around a third to a half to this small village, small town, were Jews, were Belzer Chasidim. And he joined the Belzer Hasidim. They welcomed him. He assumed, he took on all the customs of the Belzer Hasidim. He dressed as a Belzer Hasid. He spent there something like 4 years, learning Talmud, learning Torah, learning Hebrew. And then he came back to, well, the World War I began, and he was drafted while he was in Belz. So to avoid being arrested, he came back to Prague. He went into the army. The army promptly sort of declared him insane and threw him out of the army. So there he was, wearing in Prague, where people have not seen any Hasidim. There were no Hasidim living in Prague, but he wore his Belzer garb, which was kind of worn and shabby, a kaftan and a hat of the sort that the Hasidim wore there. He wouldn't touch any food that his parents made. He mostly ate bread and onions. So he was a very unpleasant to be with because he didn't speak to anybody. He was he couldn't go back to Belz because it was still, there was conflict there between Russians and the Germans, and it was a mess. So he stayed in Prague, and he gradually sort of shed his Hasidic clothing over a period of about 2 years, because he was kind of an embarrassment to his parents, and he restarted his friendship with the young people whom he had been friends with before he went to Belz. Among them was Kafka. He spent a lot of time with Kafka, and he taught Kafka Hebrew, and also, so it is surmised, he told Kafka many of the stories that he heard, particularly the stories of Rabbi Nachman. And people who do literary analysis recognize many elements of Rabbi Nachman's stories in Kafka's tales. So he had a big influence on a small circle of people. He became sick, probably from the very limited diet, but just before the world, and then while in Prague, he wrote this book. And his brother helped him edit it, and it was published, and it became very popular, not just among Jews, but among the Czech population. It was written in Czech originally because it introduced them to stories and to a way of life which was very exotic. And this was shortly before World War II, and the war was brewing. He left for Israel, and his books were then declared sort of corrupt literature and were burned. And in Israel, he made a very meager living translating from a variety of languages into Hebrew. So, and his brothers sent him money, so he made a meager living there. But he was alone most of the time. He was a loner. And he became sicker and sicker. And in 1943, at the age of 50, he died. But the book survived, and his brother republished it in 1968. And that's where I first read the story of the soldiers, of the Hungarian officers. So that's the story of Jerzy Langer. And it sort of answers your question. Where did he hear these stories? These were stories that the Hasidim told about variety of Rebbes, not just their own. They would sit around after working hard all day. There was no electricity in Belz. They sat around the candle and they would tell stories. And these are the stories that they told. So the Rebbe sang an extremely complex melody version of Solok HaKashmar. So I will just hum for you the nigun without the complexities, the beautiful complexities that the Rebbe put in. And the song goes like this, just the melody. La, 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 la. La, 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 la. La, 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 la. La, 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 la. Now you will see, actually, even though this is a Hungarian song, it has the classic structure of a nigun. A nigun begins on this plane of being. La, 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 la. And then it takes you up to a higher world. La, 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 la. La, 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 la. And then brings you back down. La, 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 la. La, 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 la. Oh. So I hum the sniggle so that to inspire you to see if you can, what you can read into or get out of the story of Yaakov Fischer's Kvitzat Haderech trip to Swat. Any ideas? Any questions? Comments? Let me ask you this. Which story moved you more? Or did any of these two stories move you? The one of the officers or the one of Yaakov Fish and the Rebbe?
Well, the second one of Yaakov Fish and the Rebbe moved me more, and I think my idea is the idea of being able to go to somewhere so incredibly spiritual, having that the Rebbe had that ability but he was also able to share that, you know, with his follower.
That sounds actually maybe exactly right on. I never thought of that. Yes, yes. The ability of a Rebbe to transport you to a holy place, like Swat. And that's what you were, I think, saying. Am I
Yeah.
right?
Yes.
Any other comments? Anybody like the first story? Yeah, I always related to the first story, the the easy way that we miss the obvious and the consequences of that. The consequences of that.
I think study and expecting the traditional often obscures the extraordinary and the spiritual.
Yeah.
You miss that, yes,
Yeah.
and that story really brought that home for me.
Yeah. This was something like Rabbi Green brought up, didn't it? That you listened to, that I didn't. The missing of the essence, Judith.
Yes, that's true. This is Art Green that Paul is talking about, from Hebrew College, who was teaching a series of classes, and he did bring this up. Yes, the spiritual message as opposed to the didactic message.
Yeah.
I think our training is so much to look at the academic, didactic message and to analyze it so closely. That's that's the bulk of the Western tradition anyway, or a good part of it. Schooling yourself to look at another side, it exists. It doesn't only exist in Judaism, it exists in other spiritual environments as well. But it's easy to miss it because we focus so much on the academic, the things that we have to learn and memorize and do the same way as we've done them years and year after year after year. So yes, the first story really
exactly
for that reason.
And it's so comfortable to fall back on that, and so uncomfortable to look at the unusual, so that they actually two Hasidim averted their eyes from the Shekhinah. Yeah. Well, we have one more evening, and as usual, I messed up on the recording. I forgot to push the record button at the beginning, but I think we recorded most of it. So a gutes Woch, have a nice week, and Shavua Tov, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
So I'm going to end the meeting.